one of the things that we're realizing, and this is not unique to the Catholic Church, I don't want to get all philosophical, but this is part of living in a postmodern world, is that religious identity is much more fragile than it was in the past. Charles Taylor, Canadian philosopher, speaks of the fragilization of identity. And I suppose I can put this just in a, in a real anecdotal way. For a reasonably good number of the people in this room, but not all, particularly generationally of my age and beyond, we mostly inherited our Catholic identity whole cloth. I was raised in a French-Canadian Catholic family. I was never given a choice. I would never, we went to Mass, I went to Catholic schools, and then, I went to college. And for a while there, I kind of left Catholicism behind me, and I became an evangelical and all of this. And a lot of us did that, and some of us went in the opposite direction and became agnostics or Buddhists or something for a while. And then gradually we wrestled with the tradition, and we made it our own, and it became our own identity. That narrative is becoming, it's not disappeared at all, but it's less common for younger generations. Largely because statistically it's less common for millennials, for example, to be raised by two caregivers who practice the same faith, and they're the same caregivers throughout their childhood. There's no judgment in there, that's just an empirical fact, right? So it's far more likely that they may for a while, maybe go to Mass for a while, then their parents divorce and their mother remarries somebody who's Lutheran, they go to a Lutheran church for a while, then maybe they don't go for a good deal, then they go to Texas A&M and they attend a retreat and they find their Catholic faith again. And see, that's a great story, but that's a different story than mine in some ways. Because that's not an identity inherited, wrestled with, and then made their own. That's an identity that's sort of picked here and there, and it's much more fragile. Does this make sense anyway? Okay, doesn't make it good or bad, it's just different. So identity is just much more fragile than it once was. Now, I think our church leaders recognize that religious identity is a lot more fragile, all right? But their solution is to say, so we're going to have to double down on doctrinal orthodoxy. That's the only way we can combat the fragility of identity. And so I think there ends up being less tolerance for disagreement in the church because, we might lose them entirely, right? They already don't know much of anything. We can't afford to introduce different ideas because they don't know what, the Ten Commandments are. So I understand that, but I also think it's doomed to failure. That strategy just won't work. Now, how does that pay off? If you have church leaders who are obsessed with the fragility of religious identity, and they think the only solution is to be absolutely clear about the Orthodox faith in a very narrow, monochromatic way that brooks no disagreement, that's going to shape the kind of people they want being leaders in the church, all right? And that's going to shape sometimes, in some places, San Antonio clearly accepted, a rigid kind of curriculum for seminary formation and so on and so forth, all right? Because the idea is we've got to indoctrinate them in the faith to confront this fragility of identity. So that's a long and meandering answer, but I think those dynamics are at work in the seminary right now. Now, one of the things, seminary education's been very influenced by the commitments of Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, who had very clear understandings of what a priest's identity was and how forming them should work. I'm going to be interested to see whether Pope Francis, who clearly has a somewhat different understanding of the priesthood, whether that's going to filter down into seminary formation, vocational discernment. In other words, we had, for good or for ill, a generation of JP2 priests, we used to call them. I'm going to be very interested to see in the decades ahead, are we going to have a generation of Pope Francis priests? And if we do, I think they'll look different. I think they'll be drawn to the priesthood with just as good motives as those before, but they're going to be drawn to something different than that earlier generation of priests were attracted to. That's not a bad thing. I think that's just the way this stuff works.